Paul loves onion volcanoes, but found himself moving miles away from the nearest hibachi. However, Paul had spent years preparing for such a move, because Paul also loves real volcanoes. Foresight's a wonderful thing. Invest in innovation, including robotics, with Opto.
Welcome, Yuri. It's great to have you back on the show. How are things?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
No worries at all. So we're here today to talk about life sciences. You've got several products in this space. So I want to kind of get under the hood of the investment case for the space as a whole, and then we'll dig into a few of the subcategories as well. But perhaps I can start with the performance of this space in general. I read, I think it was in one of your reports, that the Nasdaq Biotechnology Index has outperformed the S&P by 467% over the last 25 years, and that was actually as of the end of January, so perhaps it's outperformed more significantly since. But why has the sector diverged so significantly from the wider US market, and perhaps more personally from the wider tech sector as well?
Yeah, look, we put that chart into the report because I think a lot of people forget how powerful the biotech sector has been as a source of return for investors. It's even outperformed the technology sector, which is sort of seen as the big winner of the last 20 years. I think there are several drivers. The biggest one is sort of innovation, right? I think biotechnology is undergoing like a revolution, really. If you look back to the start of the decade, or 2 decades ago in the 2000s, it cost $100 million to sequence the human genome. And that cost today is about $1,000. And that sort of innovation is driving all kinds of improvements in terms of how we understand how the biology works, how we understand how medicines interact with the human body. And that's led to a burst of innovation of new drugs, which we've seen in the approvals data as well over this period. I think also you're seeing a growing market. Healthcare spending is a big proportion of GDP, keeps increasing, and it's growing. And really, it's an area that you would expect rich society to spend more and more money making sure that people live longer. And that's something that's really helped the sector's returns. The final bit is regulation. I think the FDA probably realized that they need to step in to sort of let innovative medicines come through. And so they've introduced lots of different types of designations in terms of accelerating approvals, breakthrough designations, etc., to really help the industry get drugs to patients faster.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, just to jump in, I think the FDA drug approvals have tripled since 2002. So that shows this kind of exponential growth almost within this space. Yeah,
it's really interesting if you look at it. I mean, Nature does a fantastic paper every year looking at the trends in sort of approvals. We've seen a big increase. 22 actually was a bit of a dip because you had this COVID hangover. But last year, 55 new medicines were approved. 5 of them were gene therapies, including the first CRISPR therapy as well. I think that's really telling to the level of innovation that's going on in the sector. And part of the drive here has been this kind of new types of designations and approval channels. The FDA's really said, okay, we're going to try to get these medicines to patients, of course, as long as they meet the clinical trial thresholds. And we're also going to work closely with industry to understand how to design clinical trials to get approved. And that's been a big change over the last decade.
Fantastic. Well, let's dig into some of the tailwinds. You alluded to them that are fueling growth in this space and the life sciences megatrend as a whole. The UN predicts, for example, that the over 60 population to double by 2050. So what are the key areas of opportunity you see for the life sciences industry to address the needs of that emerging demographic?
Yeah, I think a lot of people realize that healthcare and aging are kind of intricately linked together. What's really telling is, the UN forecast is about 2 billion people by 2050 will be over the age of 60. And this population is disproportionately represented in healthcare spending. So about 58% of healthcare spending in the US is by people over the age of 55. And there's a lot of areas that are kind of more exposed to this aging demographic, oncology being one of the biggest ones. What's really interesting is that oncology really is a disease of aging. But we're also talking about Alzheimer's and neurological disorders. And these areas, this is kind of a growth driver for it. And the other part is this quality of life argument, which is that as people age, they unfortunately acquire diseases. But can we have medicines that modify these diseases so that people can live longer, but also have a better quality of life as they live longer.
Yeah.
And this is a really powerful trend. And as you know, I'm a millennial myself. Older individuals have just a lot more spending power, and that spending power is proportionally being spent on healthcare as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And another phenomenon linked to that, and we've kind of discussed it already when you mentioned genomics, is the growth in personalised medicine, which obviously helps to combat some of the things that you've already discussed. But talk to us about what that means and why it's proving another tailwind for the overall space.
Yeah, so personalized medicine is kind of a concept that gets thrown around a lot. I think it's very interesting in many ways, but it's almost sort of, it's the same thing as kind of medicine. And maybe that's a little bit of a controversial statement, but the way I think about it is we've probably now got, ever since the approval of the first disease-modifying drug in Alzheimer's, a treatment for every disease group. We're almost there. And what that means is that the next stage is to say, okay, now that I can treat this disease group, can I come up with medicines that are specific to a specific patient population that might work better in that patient population? And that's really when you start to get to this personalization level. And genetics is a big driver of that. As I said, it's much cheaper now to sequence the genome of a human being. And therefore, can we use those genetic signals to figure out if drugs are going to work better or not in other areas? But also it's about broadening out these medicines and figuring out that actually you have more and more use cases for different types of medicines based on the types of individuals. So, you take the example of obesity, right? We've had the GLP-1 drug revolution. That's stage one. Stage two is going to be, okay, are there sub-segment populations, like, for example, extreme obesity, where maybe we need drugs that are better than 15% weight loss, that are sort of 25% weight loss? Or is there a group of patients that needs more tolerable treatments? And that is really what personalized medicine is. It sort of starts at the top of the funnel and moves down. We haven't quite gotten to the point, which I think what everyone dreams of, is this idea that there's a medicine personalized to each individual patient. And so that's why I always say that it's a little bit of a term that gets thrown around, but we were probably not there yet, but we're starting to move into these different subgroups, and we're much better at doing that and getting medicines for that.
Yeah, fascinating. So we're almost approaching this inflection point, that we'll see the scaling of some of these treatments.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're getting much better at it, right? Because we are much better at diagnostics, we're much better at genetics, we're much better at omics, understanding proteomics and the idea that interaction of genetics with the way proteins are produced in the human body. And can we use all of this data and information? And of course, this feeds into AI as a tool to personalize medication, or at least to find drugs that fit that particular patient subgroup. And I think we're at that point now.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, let's move on then to a hallmark of life sciences is, and we've talked about regulation in general, but I guess from an outsider's perspective or someone not as familiar with the sector, they might conclude that a hallmark of this space is regulatory uncertainty. So often exacerbated by the changing nature of US politics. Given we're in an election year, I think this is an opportune moment to just briefly discuss what's going on there. How do you see a Biden or Trump administration impacting sector growth? Is one likely to prove more conducive to growth than the other? Give us a sense of that.
Yeah, look, it's a bit of a nail-biter election, right? The odds are sort of 50-50 depending on the source you look at. But we look very carefully at the different sectors and try to understand what it means. I think healthcare is always in the crosshairs of government regulation. In the US, government is a big payer for healthcare through Medicaid and Medicare.
Yeah.
But also, it has a very strong hand in terms of regulating the areas, especially drug pricing. And both sides of the chamber are always very, firebrand about certain areas of the market. Look, the way we think about it is the election outcome. I think who takes the presidency is probably less important. I think just marginally, it's probably better if Biden stays in power because, as they say, it's better the devil you know. It's unclear, but I think they're probably about equal on their sort of warpath if it comes to healthcare. I think the worst case outcome is probably going to be a Democratic sweep across the House and Senate. Looking at things now, I think it's unlikely that the Senate will flip Democratic, so that's an unlikely scenario. But that would be the worst case outcome. I think the one thing about stock market investing in general, not just healthcare, is that the market likes certainty in some respect. And it almost doesn't matter if it's bad news. So we had the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, which obviously had a big provision in terms of drug pricing and this idea that the US for the first time is going to negotiate drug pricing for Medicare and Medicaid and set some drug prices. this is really bad for the industry, and the industry has been fighting against this. But in a way, for the stock market, it's clarity, right? We know what the situation is.
Yeah.
So we think that that's helpful to the overall situation. So drug pricing is unlikely to come on the agenda again. But, never say never. As I said, if a democratic sweep, there could be more risks to the sector. We think the status quo continues, and probably the sector is going to be fine through this election period.
Yeah, fantastic. And you referenced AI earlier, so I want to get onto that. I mean, a lot of previous podcast guests have actually often described the accelerative nature of AI when it intersects with another powerful secular trend or technology, such as those present in the life sciences sector. So at that intersection between AI and life sciences, what excites you most?
There's a lot to be excited about. I think one thing AI probably burst on the scene last year with the introduction of ChatGPT, but I think it's been used in the healthcare space for a long time. Even in 2021, the FDA basically in their report wrote that almost 100 applications had some form of AI used in their process, whether it's within the clinic, within the drug discovery process, or whatever it may be. I think it lends itself beautifully to this. If you think of AI as simply a big statistical model that can ingest lots of data and give you kind of patterns, which is what language is and kind of the world is, the biological system is perfect for that. There's loads of data. It just petabytes of it produced, lots of very complex interactions. And so we think once you apply these modern tools to this, you can see a lot of insights. And some people go as bullish as saying this will be the step that takes biology away from the realm of uncertainty in a way, because we don't really understand fully how biological systems work, especially areas like the brain, to what might be an engineering type system. And that is really exciting. There's plenty of companies working in this space. We think it's an additive to the productivity process. Well, we talked before about why the sector has done so well. I think the sector has a really bad reputation in terms of its productivity. Notoriously, people talk about, it costs $1 billion, maybe upwards to $3 billion to get a drug to the market. And this is why it's such a risky sector to invest in. But actually, if you look at it, so people used to talk about what they called the inverse Moore's law, Moore's law, Room's law. And that law basically says that productivity is going the opposite direction of Moore's law in biotech. But that was very popular up until 2010. But actually, if you look at the statistics since then, productivity is not stopped getting worse and has actually improved a bit. And we think AI and areas like that are going to be the ones that are going to improve productivity further. And this has been a big boon for the sector and will be going forward as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the flip side, or the bear case for AI's involvement in this sector, I guess, people will question the kind of sensitivity of some of the data available in this space. It's perhaps the most kind of personal sensitive data available. So what's your take on kind of AI's impact in that regard? Should we be more conservative in our approach in this space?
Yeah, great question. I think we've been adept at collecting biological data. There exist huge biobanks, in countries like Denmark, for example, is notorious for having basically biological data on all of its citizens, anonymized as well. And so I think there's going to have to be government intervention on this. But I think large pharmaceutical companies do have these databases on individuals in terms of their genetic makeup and things like that. And I think that this has to be very well regulated. I'm not going to speculate on how a generalized AI is going to use this to its advantage or disadvantage, or if anything bad will come out of it. I think the risks are absolutely possibly there. But I think it's going to be regulated. The data is going to have to be somehow centralized somewhere and used correctly. It's hard, right? The data itself, people used to think it holds value, but if you look at the share price of 23andMe and things like that, it's less clear. I think the data plus the ability to develop drugs and use that data is really where the power lies of that. So we think probably going to be regulation, probably going to have to be centralized somehow, but governments have been doing this for a while. So I think it's going to be just about okay for this part of the kind of development of AI.
Great. I think that sets the scene nicely for kind of life sciences as a megatrend. I titled this interview, a working title, but an undervalued megatrend. So we've talked about the megatrend and what's involved there. Now let's talk about the investment approach team are employing to kind of capitalize on some of the growth in this space. So firstly, given the inherent risks that we've talked about and touched on so far within the life sciences sector, how does Tema look to manage that risk? Are there any general sort of best practice points you can point us to?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say undervalued. I think the big thing is, right, you've got this growing aging population. You've got a biotech sector that's historically performed really well, but we've been in a sort of 2.5 year bear market in biotech. And I think that's the undervaluation point, why we think it's such an exciting opportunity, because the innovations continued, but since 2020, 2021, we've had this bear market. So valuations are extremely attractive out there. And we've had a bit of a rally since the last summer, but we think it's kind of just starting. So that's an aside. In terms of our process, like I think there's a dizzying number of risks in this sector, right? Like if you just think about it, starting from the biological risk of how biological systems work, the preclinical risk, like can we set up experiments that are actually going to prove that it works? Then you have to get into the clinic. Does it work in a human being? Then once the drug is, you've gone on the clinical trial, you have the regulatory approval risk. Throughout this whole process, you earn zero revenue. So therefore, there's a funding risk through this period. And the funding windows, as we saw in 2021, they can shut very, very quickly. And companies have to be very good at managing that. And even after you've gone through all of that process, you have a drug on the market, you have the whole commercial and pricing and regulatory and access risks. And so often, when I talk to especially like young graduates, they ask me, what sector should I look at? I'm like, well, if you look at biotechnology, you've got every set of possible risks. Yes, it's specialized, but actually that's probably a great training ground to understand how risks work in the financial sector. How we approach these risks in Tema is we sort of try to think of it as multi-layered, right? Risk management really is about multiple layers. So we start by looking and narrowing our funds down to therapeutic areas that are exciting, have lots of innovation going on and are growing. That protects you from areas that are maybe price gouging or have a lot more risk or a lot riskier from an innovation perspective. So you're sort of fishing in a good pond, if you will. And then, the type of rod you use, which is the investment process, we'll get onto that, I'm sure, in a second, but we look for companies that have solid operating bases. And in a way, what that means is good R&D teams, good track records in terms of R&D, because frankly, there's a lot of pitfalls. There's a lot of companies that just go under in this space. But also this funding risk, which I was talking about, which I think is really important. It's all well and good to have great science and great data, but if you can't get it to the finish line in terms of funding and you run out of money, you're basically as good as nothing. And so we monitor those two risks as a key part of our investment process. And then when you finally think about the kind of next stage, which is, okay, even calling all these trials and understanding how it works, you need to be thinking about asymmetric risk reward opportunities. And so you got to do your work on operating base, you got to do your work on funding risk. That protects you a little bit from the downside, but you have to get into opportunities where you have positive asymmetric risk reward. So that means is that we're not trying to predict the outcome of clinical trials, but what we're trying to do is find those opportunities where that outcome might be mispriced in the marketplace. And I think that's a really helpful way to mitigate some of the risks. And then the final piece is putting that all together into a portfolio. We employ quite a rigorous portfolio construction process that really looks at investing more in companies where we think the risk reward is really positive, but being cognizant of the type of company it is. So whether it's an emerging biotech, which is a company that's just doing innovation and doesn't have any revenues, those positions are necessarily going to have to be smaller. But if they're more established companies, those positions can be a bit bigger than those are. And then that's how our portfolio construction process. And together, these areas, right, the being in the right pond, fishing with the right fishing rod, i.e. having this operating base and funding risk, and then putting the portfolio together really helps mitigate a lot of the risks that you see in the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to build on and kind of pull out this idea that obviously you're employing an active management approach. And obviously that's not something that's done across the sector amongst your competitors, etc. So just highlight for us why that is so essential to the approach in this space.
And this is a big thing we talk about a lot. I think if you look at the dispersion of returns, even on a 2 or 3 year horizon in the biotech sector, it's enormous. And you basically have lots of really, really, really fantastic winners, but many, many companies go to zero. And that dispersion of returns really doesn't lend itself to a passive approach. And unfortunately, a lot of the funds out there, especially in the ETF world, are basically passive investments in this space.
Yeah.
So if you start with that as your background, you'd have to really understand that an active approach is necessary, because you want to be in the winners and you don't really want to be in the losers. And maybe I'll give you the example of but there's much more going on under the surface. So the example of obesity is an interesting one. And we've recently written an article about that. If you think about the obesity space, it's very exciting. But actually, there's loads of assets. There's about 400, by latest estimates, of drugs trying to go after just a handful of targets. That's 400 different assets that an investor has to pick from to decide which is going to be the winning one. And know when that happens. And as you know, the probability of success is quite low in this space. So even if you narrow down to cardiometabolic as a space, only about 15% of drugs make it from phase 1 to approval. So you've got high failure rate, lots of competing assets, lots of innovation. So that means that you really need to be picking the right stuff. Then you need expertise as well. I think that's very important. It's highly specialized. You really need to understand the science and understand all of the interaction of these risks. But it goes further than that, right? There's it's more than just obesity. There's the cardiometabolic interactions, right? Understanding that obesity is the root cause of other diseases, how that works together. The space is evolving. So companies are producing big outcomes trials, which create barriers to entry. How does that interact with new players? And then the theme, as you know, can sometimes get overvalued, and things might get out of whack. And if you're just invested in a passive way, you can lose out, because things can come back to normal. And that's why I think it's important to have an active manager. And the funds that we've got are managed by someone who's spent 25 years basically in industry, but also investing in the market, has a fantastic track record looking at this space. And that's what you really need to combat these risks, manage them, but also to get exposure to these growth areas. And obesity is a perfect example of that.
Absolutely. And it's that manager and that management team directly speaking to, industry professionals, experts, researchers within the space actively working there now.
Yeah, that's very, very important. So we have an expert network that we utilize for the funds. Whenever we're trying to research a specific area, David and his team, they look at speaking to an expert, and they have very clever ways of figuring out which experts are important, and understanding the science, the clinical risk as well, and talking to experts that have been involved in drug development before. And that's really important, because it can't just be academic science as well. And then we have a scientific board that we're in the process of recruiting. We're really happy to announce that our first member has joined, and he's actually the pioneer, the guy one of the people who discovered GLP-1.
Wow.
He's Professor Jens Juul Holst, and he's from University of Copenhagen. He's sort of a preeminent figure. He's published almost 2,000 papers in this space, and he's come on board to help us build out our obesity and cardiometabolic fund, part of the scientific board, and we're going to be adding other members. So there's ongoing discussions, and hopefully we'll have more announcements in that space.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's really interesting news. So definitely interested to pick your brains on that at a later date. But how does, if we move back to kind of the management of the fund and the team in particular, how do you think about kind of ethical considerations? We've touched on this already, but some of these investments will involve kind of ethical debates, considerations that need to be taken, particularly in sensitive areas like genetic editing, stem cell research, etc. Is there any general best practice you would highlight in regards to those points?
Yeah, it's an interesting area. I think it's great that life science funds. What's really positive from a sort of ESG perspective is that you're already investing in helping human life and patients. And I think that's what we're really trying to do with these funds. And I think the other bit is, and Dave is a very strong believer in this, is we're investing in innovative companies. We don't invest in Me Too or companies that are maybe operating in the kind of generic drug space, or maybe companies that are more intermediaries in the healthcare system. We're really looking for companies that are going to produce breakthrough innovation for patients. That's helpful because your sort of pool is immediately the companies that are trying to do good. Now, the tools they employ, of course, sometimes can be controversial, like gene editing and stem cell research. And we do spend a bit of time making sure that the companies that we're doing are following all kinds of regulation and those parts. This is can sometimes be an existential investment risk. production, manufacturing. Often people ignore that part of it, but contamination of medication is really, really important part. And so we incorporate it as part of our investment process, and we think it's important to look at it at different kind of stages, right? As I said, the thematic area itself is already positive in terms of like we're looking for areas where they're helping patients.
Yeah.
But also within our security selection process is part of our risk assessment of criteria that these companies aren't using any kind of bad methods within production, manufacturing, or discovery that could be seen as unethical.
Okay, great. Well, we've kind of touched on a few of your funds already. Now let's dig into them specifically, talk about performance, talk about the holdings and portfolio construction there. So, I mean, you've got 3 funds in the space at the moment: Tema Oncology ETF, the Obesity and Cardiometabolic ETF, and the Tema Neuroscience and Mental Health ETF, ticker MNTL. So perhaps you can explain why you chose those specific niches within the overall life sciences sector.
Yeah. So I think it's probably helpful to go back in time and think about kind of what biotechnology investing looked like in the 1990s. When the NBI, which is the Nasdaq Biotech Index, was first introduced, it just had 100 members. And the space was much, much smaller than it is today, both in terms of market size, number of companies, and number of treatments. I mean, in the early 2000s, there was probably only about 4 different treatments for breast cancer. If you fast forward to today, you've got 225 companies in MBI. You have almost 3,300 companies within the GICS healthcare sector. And then you've got 26, fortunately, effective treatments for breast cancer. And so you've had this explosion and growth in the space, which is why you've seen that share price performance as well of the sector. And that means that you can start to be more discerning about the areas. You can, for the first time ever, really start to dissect by therapeutic area. And you might ask why you do that. Well, investing in a broader biotech or healthcare sector fund probably exposes you to kind of basically a passive investment. There's a lot of other stuff in there. And if you start to think about, if I dissect by therapeutic area, I can, exposed to growing big markets and areas where there's lots of innovation. So if you think about obesity within our Obesity and Cardiometabolic Fund, HRTS, that's one area that's seen a lot of interest, but also oncology and mental health as well. You're also looking for what I would say is like exposure to good companies, right? Like you exclude companies that are, as I said, intermediaries or focusing on areas that are less pertinent to an investor who wants exposure to this space. And the other thing is, by going down the vertical of therapeutic area, you're basically allowing yourself an ability to invest in adjacent bits, right? So if you take oncology, you could also be investing in diagnostics. I know we talked previously that oncology is really a disease of aging. But in fact, there's been a really worrying trend that a lot of younger people are getting certain types of cancer. Most prominently in this country, in the UK, we've seen a really tragic kind of in a really prominent figure, which is the Duchess of Cambridge. And there you need diagnostics to catch this early. And the diagnostics can be quite invasive. And so the idea is, can we come up with a blood test that can test for cancer? And so that's a key area that's part of our oncology fund as well. So you can go into this adjacency and then get exposure to these exciting bits of innovation. Similarly, if you take the cardiometabolic space, medical devices is a really important treatment intervention in that space. So can we add that to the fund? If you were going cross biotech, you wouldn't be able to do that because that's not really a biotechnology investment. And so we've decided to kind of dissect by these therapeutic areas to expose to growth, large markets, but also these adjacent parts. And we think now is probably the first time you can actually do that in what are really potentially very large markets for these types of funds. And that's why we've decided to go down this route of 3 types of therapeutic areas.
And once you pick those therapeutic areas, there's subsegments within those that you've already kind of mentioned and pointed out some of those. Do you, when you're thinking about the fund construction and portfolio construction, do you think about diversifying across different subsegments within that area, or is it more kind of bottom-up stock picking and then you're led by that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we are bottom-up stock pickers, but we are very cognizant of what the portfolio looks like afterwards.
Yeah.
So we dissect the portfolio in many, many different ways. But one of the ways we look at it is we try to think about, okay, what is the mix of emerging biotechnology companies, I mean, the ones that are pre-revenue, growing biotechnology companies and life science tools or medical devices where they have revenue lines already, and then more established players as well. And then we generally try to keep that, the end result, a balanced portfolio between those kind of risk buckets, if you will. And then, and as I said previously, also our position sizing is different depending on the type of company. And then based on technology, we try not to take overexposed risks in specific technology areas. So whether it's RNAi or gene editing or intervention through targeted oncology or ADCs, we try to make sure that we're not taking too much of a technology bet, because what you want is a bit of a broader profile. But a lot of that does come up from the bottom up rather than sort of directed top down. So that's how the funds are constructed themselves. And it gives the investors the best chance to win in this space in an active format.
And so once those themes have been identified, we talked about the sub-themes as well. If we get down to the individual equity level, what are the key sort of fundamentals, and maybe there are more kind of qualitative characteristics that typically apply to the companies that end up in your portfolios? Are there any sort of trends you can highlight?
Yeah, so we follow quite a rigorous kind of investment process. I think what's very clear about active management is that active managers add a lot of value in just the stock selection process. And it's really the bread and butter of what we're trying to do. And this is entirely fundamental bottom-up research that we do, led by David and his team, and a real focus on picking the best companies. And in general, the best way to classify it is kind of we use 4 pillars to analyze each company. The first is operating base, which we discussed before. Do they have the right R&D platform, the right management team, the right business model that they're going after? The second bit is, and do they have the right funding profile, cash flow generation, if they have assets on the market already? Those two together are really important. We need to tick on both of those to really make sure that we're protecting on downside risk. And this is really important because, as I said, you're in the right zip code in terms of therapeutic area. Now the question is, are you going to fumble that growth and fumble that exposure? And you can only fumble that. You basically protect yourself by having those two as ticks. The other two parts of the test are really valuation. Can we build a valuation case? And what's our edge? Like what's our advantage in the market versus what the market might think about the stock? And here it's kind of combined together in this asymmetric risk reward opportunities, which is what we're looking for. And so if you bring all of those together, each investment has to meet these 4 pillars before it joins the portfolio. And that's probably the best way to classify or describe the security selection process.
Yeah, just to dig into that, perhaps you can give us an example of an edge, just to make it a little bit less abstract. What would be an example of edge kind of actually manifesting in a company? Yeah,
it's great. And again, you can head up to our website. We actually have written recently an article about all of these different parts of our investment process, including how we think about edge. But look, I think it starts by saying you're actually asking that question. And I think a lot of fund managers never ask that question. They sort of make investments and they don't think, okay, I need to beat the market, and the market has an assumption about these companies. And so by explicitly incorporating in our investment process, we're trying to just ask that hard question. And I think it starts with that. That already itself is an edge. And then in terms of edge, generally it's classical, there's different ideas, but it can be either informational, behavioral, analytical. And I think a lot of the times within biotech investing, it's really analytical edge. What you're trying to do is set up these asymmetric risk reward opportunities where you say, okay, this is a clinical trial readout. I'm not going to try to call this trial, but what's actually priced into these shares? What does the market think this particular thing is? And then we go out and get evidence to suggest whether our asymmetric risk reward we're stacked in the right way. And so there's plenty of examples where we've had calls with key opinion leaders that have basically made us trim or cut positions ahead of events to try, because we felt the risk reward wasn't right going into those events. And it's this kind of active management that adds value for these funds over the long run. And that's a source of analytical edge, using an expert network to ascertain that advantage. And we have David's come up with some very clever ways of using expert networks and expert opinion, because often it can be a little bit biased, or there's lots of different individuals and they might have different views. that I think is extremely clever in the marketplace and really gives us this edge when investing in these binary events.
Yeah, fantastic. And just overall then, I mean, I assume given the nature of the space, you're employing a long-term investment horizon when you're thinking about these and the management of the fund. But talk to us about how you balance that more active portfolio management style with that longer-term horizon.
Yeah, I think we're very much long-term. And I think David's experience is perfect here. It combines two parts. He spent a long time working for Rockefeller Capital Management, where he ran a healthcare fund over a decade. And then at the same time, he's had some stints at Millennium and Balyasny. And I think those two areas are well-known hedge funds that are really a lot more short-term.
Yeah.
And I think the biotech sector is basically that. You need a combination of long-term vision and understanding where trends are going, the rise of weight loss drugs and the obesity trend, and how to invest long-term, but also to be tactical and understand that the sector is prone to bouts of risk on, risk off. The sector is binary clinical events. And so you have to be able to manage those risks in the medium term before you get to the sunny uplands of the long-term trend. And that, I think, is the best way to describe how the investment process is. We're in innovative breakthrough companies, but we're not sort of just blindly investing in a passive way. We're trying to manage those risks through that so that we can get exposure to the winners of tomorrow.
Yeah, fantastic. And to finish on these funds then, perhaps you can just talk us through the performance of each one, maybe over the last 12 months or pick a time horizon that makes sense. And perhaps as well highlight which of those is the top performer, and if you can also give us a sense of the key tailwinds bolstering growth for each of those.
Absolutely. I have to be a little bit careful here about talking about performance, so I should probably say that if you want to get the most up-to-date performance, you can head to the Tema ETFs, TEMA ETFs.com website and get the latest fact sheets and the latest performance numbers. I think since inception, all funds are well ahead of their benchmark, which is the Nasdaq Biotech Index, and which is great, and we're really pleased with that performance. And I think there's been several tailwinds that have helped the funds. I think within the oncology space, there's been quite a lot of M&A that's happened. This is a sign of why we think the market is healing after this period of undervaluation. Large biopharma companies are running up against patent cliffs for some of their biggest medicines, and they need to replace them. And a lot of the innovation happens in smaller biotechnology companies, and what they're doing is buying these up. And our oncology fund has been very fortunate to be exposed in reasonable size to some of these M&A transactions that have happened, and we've had a very good hit rate there. And so I think that's been a nice tailwind, and it's generally a tailwind for the sector because that money goes in, these companies get bought, but then the money returns to biotech investors who then have to reinvest in other areas and new ideas. So it's a driver of return over the long run. And so I think that's been a driver there, but also innovation has been a really big thing. And the reason why that innovation has been really powerful in oncology is it's happening in areas where we're trying to replace something that is a very big market. So let me give you an example. Antibody drug conjugates, ADCs, are effectively a really clever way of chemotherapy. So the idea is you take an antibody that targets a cancer cell, and then you attach to it using a linker, a toxic chemical. Now, we all know that chemotherapy is just a toxic chemical and it has terrible side effects, killing healthy cells and healthy tissue. But what if I can attach it to an antibody that can target actual cancer cells so that it delivers the toxic payload just to cancer cells? And so we know that loads of patients, I think the number is like 37%, still get chemotherapy today. So it's a vast, vast market. And if we can develop these linkers and these drugs, and some of them are already on the market, this could be potentially a very, very large oncology market. And now we're seeing loads of M&A in that space as well. And so that is kind of exposing yourself to the right area where the technology is ripe and the strategic buyers are coming in is a real driver of return for that fund. If I look at our best performing fund, which has been the cardiometabolic and obesity fund, that fund is just benefited from, I think, interest in the space, but a realization that the market is going to be a lot bigger than anyone thought. And the reason for that is obesity is, first of all, a very, very large market. The latest estimate from the Imperial study is about 1 billion people in the world live with obesity. And that number might go up to about 1.9 billion in a decade's time. So it's a real epidemic. And we also know obesity is associated with about 220 different diseases, from diabetes to cardiovascular disease to liver disease. And what's really happening is a revolution. These GLP-1 drugs are now showing clinical data, positive effects on cardiovascular outcomes, on liver disease, on kidney disease, on sleep apnea. And as we prove out more and more of this, the market was just going to grow. And I think that's what's being reflected. Not just the share prices of the bellwethers like Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, but some of the newer crop of companies that are coming up that the fund is invested in. And that's why we've seen that good performance. And finally, MNCL, which is one of the newest addition to our fund. Yep. Look, I think it's super exciting, right? And this is a very catalyst-rich future for it. The fund has recently launched, so I think the catalysts are ahead of it. It's really difficult. Neuroscience is the final frontier of medicine. And I think we all know how hard it is to understand how the brain's chemistry works.
Yeah.
And the innovation's coming. As I said, we've got a disease-modifying agent for the first time in Alzheimer's. So we think that there's just going to be this big burst of innovation. And this is the biggest market of all. Because the latest estimates is about 43% of the world's population has some sort of mental or neurological disorder.
Wow.
Whether it's Alzheimer's or depression or schizophrenia or whatever it might be, it's enormous. And what's really interesting about mental health is it has very deep effects on just well-being and quality of life and productivity. And if we can start to solve some of those problems, that could be a real revolution as well. And so that is, I think, there's a lot of positive future return drivers for that fund in the future as our newest crop, as our newest member of the crop.
Yeah, fantastic. I was going to ask you for your next big idea, but it seems that if you had to pick from all of the trends that we've discussed so far, a trend or an innovation that you're particularly excited about, would it be that neuroscience one, or is there something else that you'd pick out?
This is a really interesting question, because I think in this space, there's just so many exciting things going on. I mean, you've got gene editing, you've got gene therapy, cell therapy. I think I'll probably go back to this idea that what really excites me, particularly as an investor, is this, not just the ADC. I'll probably talk about their sister area, which is a radioligand therapy. This is an area that a lot of people didn't really believe in. And this is the idea of replacing radiotherapy with targeted radiotherapy. Right. So again, very similar idea to ADCs. Yeah. You take a nuclear, like a radioactive substance, you attach it with a linker to an antibody and target cancer cells that way. Right. Instead of blasting radio waves, which can also destroy healthy tissue. This is exciting in part because ADCs have been well discovered by large cap pharma, and most of them already have an ADC platform in place, whereas radiotherapy is actually, there's a lot of gaps if you look at all the big strategic buyers. So there's excitement from an investment perspective. It's exciting from the science perspective because we're just starting that. I mean, there's some agents already on the market, but it's just getting started. And this has a lot of potential to help patients. And what I think is really clever here is you can test these as a diagnostic first. So this is originally how it was used, right? The radioactive substance wasn't powerful. It wasn't able to kill cells, but you used it to dye to almost find where the tumors were. Yeah. And now, so that means you can easily test two components of the drug, and then you can then develop an actual drug by replacing the radioactive bit with something that is a bit more potent. Yeah. And I think this is very, very exciting space. And we've just seen AstraZeneca take out one of the companies there. And I think there's going to be more and more activity in this space and just more and more innovation.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, a fascinating insight to end on, I think. That just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.